Welcome to the Strategic Pursuit Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan.a.silvestre, and today we're joined with Ryan Silveira-Stray. Ryan has worked closely with a wide range of lenders, including the SBA. He brings hands-on experience in teaching and applying key skills in mergers and acquisitions. He currently works with a few different institutions, helping entrepreneurs gain access to capital.
Thank you, man. Appreciate that.
Ryan, let's take it back a little. Beginning is very interesting. Let's do a little bit of a condensed version. What brought you into the street of mergers and acquisitions, or even the numbers?
There's actually a funny story as to what brought me into this industry. And to be honest, it was because I had a crush on a girl and I didn't have the confidence to walk up to her and say, when I was back in college, I was studying a couple other things. My major was in finance and economics, which is where I hold my degrees in currently. I was studying astrophysics, so I can bore you to death on celestial theory if you want, but it wasn't a career where I was already having some doubts. It wasn't a career where I had too many job options. Nobody wants to hire somebody to talk to them about black holes and quasars and whatnot, right? There was a girl I had a crush on, and she was taking a class called economics. And at the time, all I knew about economics, was home economics, cupcakes and baking things. I'm like, yeah, absolutely. This is going to be fantastic. We're going to bake cakes together. She's going to fall in love with me. And so I signed up for the same class that she did. And coincidentally, it turned out to be a class that came naturally to me. Obviously when I walked into the class, I didn't see any ovens. I'm like, oh, what is this? And they were talking about demand and supply and all this other stuff. And after a while, I just realized that it was easier to digest, easier for me to understand. I quickly became one of the tutors in class. I quickly started working closely with the professor who was active in the field of mergers and acquisitions. And he brought me on as a intern to work with him under his organization. It just became a place where I felt comfortable because I had a good command. Things came, I can't say easy, but I didn't have to spend 3 hours studying for every 1 hour of class time that I was inside the classroom. And I think after that, the rest was history. I started to work for a broker, a small business broker at the time. So my job was to help find the capital for the different businesses. And over time, my name got, spread throughout different places and says, hey, if you need help, call Ryan. He'll help you build a business plan and whatnot. And I ended up going over to a large company on Wall Street, literally right on Water and Wall in Lower Manhattan. And I was there for about 10 years, I would say, doing M&A deals. And same thing that I do now. The only difference is there's a few extra zeros or less zeros on different deals.
No, amazing. Okay, let's jump into lenders and different types of lending options that are available to entrepreneurs. Give us the top 3 loans that you mostly will see people get into on the buy side.
We're talking about traditional debt, 2 main categories. You have SBA financing that is heavily misunderstood. The SBA acts as your cosigner. They are a quasi-governmental guarantee that you're going to get on your loan, where the SBA, the United States Small Business Administration, says Brandon meets all these guidelines and he can't pay the note, he can't pay the loan. I, the SBA, will pay you, Mr. Bank, up to 80% of whatever he borrowed on his behalf. So the idea is it should make you feel more comfortable, the lender, that you'll get your money back. So that's the general idea. So the SBA does not lend money to the public directly, only under times of economic distress, like COVID, which is what we went through a couple years ago. If there's a hurricane or a flood, a fire, earthquake, stuff like that. So you have to look at, does the participating lender around me, the bank, or sometimes you have specialty lenders, do they participate in the SBA program? Now, the SBA, their spot is that they make it more accessible to have access to that money. They make it easier. Typically the down payment on your business is going to be lower. The amount of attention they put onto your cash flow, your credit, when we'll talk about those things in a moment, will be a little bit easier. That's the beauty of the SBA loan. Now, outside of that, any bank, ABC Bank, will do a conventional loan, or what they call a normal business loan, without that cosigner of the SBA. Now, with that one, the bank can say, I'll give you the loan, but only if you are really bankable. Usually that means you have 2 years of positive cash flow history with the business. You're able to have a larger equity injection into the company. The cash flow of the business also looks a little bit healthier. So if you meet those, then the bank will give you one of their loans by themselves without the SBA. Sometimes that loan is a little bit cheaper. Sometimes the SBA is a little bit cheaper. So it all depends on what we're looking at and how they peg the rate. But those are the 2 basic categories. Now somebody like me will say, hey, let's fill in the gap of whatever we need for financing, or let's take a portion of this out because I just found that there is a grant, and there's a real life case that I'm doing right now, someone's borrowing money to buy a pizzeria franchise. This is a call that I had earlier today, and they need X amount of dollars. I think it was like $500,000 they need to open up their pizzeria. I said, well, 30 of those $1,000 I can get the money for you in the form of a grant, because the state that he's in, the Economic Development Authority, every state has an Economic Development Authority, is offering a grant that says, I will pay up to 25% of the rent that you're going to pay for the new location that you're going to be in, as long as you can create a job for your community. So that's the only requirement. So because of that, I'm saying you're going to be in debt a little bit less, because I was able to carve out a portion of the loan that you would have had to pay in the form of a grant. Or there's tax credits, or there's specialty loans, or in order to avoid one general loan for everybody and for all the different uses of proceeds that you're having, I might be able to say, hey, I'm going to take out, $20,000 of the money that you're asking for, because it's to buy an asset, and I'm going to give you an asset loan, which has better terms and conditions than a working capital loan. That's why I match the debt classes with the liability class. A working capital loan always has a higher interest rate than an asset loan. To buy a car, your rate is going to be lower than to get a credit card, because a credit card, you can use the money for anything that you want, but a car loan is only for that car. And the idea is that there's a collateral that I, as a lender, can hold in case you don't pay. I can go and repossess that car. But if I give you access to a credit card where you can use the money for anything that you want, even if it's for the business, there's no way for me to come back and guarantee that cash is coming back to me as the lender. So that's why my job would be, let's take a look at how you're going to use the money, and let me connect it with the right loan, because the right loan product for you might be 3 different loans to combine to give you the funding.
That makes perfect sense. And I'm glad you touched on merging different loans together, not just using or relying on one. You can play around with the different types of loans that are available to you out there. So that kind of brings me into the next question. Let's go into the more non-conventional loan. So private lenders, some people even do crowdfunding. We won't get too deep into that this time, but talk to me about that. How have you seen an SBA mix with, some PE funds?
So that's depending on the company. So if it's a brand new, company, like, pre-revenue, it's just an idea, as an example, it's going to be very different than I'm buying an existing business, a car wash that has been around for 20 years. The products that are available, the terms and conditions are going to be drastically different. You're mentioning PE. So equity is always by far the most expensive. I have that as a plan G, plan F, all the way down the line, because 2 things are going to happen. One, you're going to private equity, you go into the private markets because you cannot get the money through the normal capital markets. And that means that there's higher risk associated with it. And in business, we're always taught that the more risk, the more reward. Well, look at that from the lender's point of view or the investor's point of view. So the cost of capital now starts to go up. My job is not only just to get you the money, but it's to make sure that the money comes at the lowest cost of capital as possible, right? So that you have more cash flow. But that's only problem number 1. Problem number 2 is that with private equity, you're diluting the equity of your company. You used to be 100% owner. Now, because you saw some PE funds, we're going to, you might go down to 90% or 10%. It all depends on the terms and conditions of what's going on. So it's not always a bad thing. I don't want to label it as an absolute bad thing. There's every tool has a job where it does its job amazingly, right? So with private equity, it makes the most sense when I know that I have a very good opportunity to make a high return on my investment, but there's no way that I can justify borrowing that money because my cash flow doesn't justify it. For example, my competitor is about to close the doors. I just found out. So before it goes out to the public that my competitor is about to close the door, I need to raise, $1 million, but I'm a $100,000 a year pizzeria. There's no way I can convince any lender to give me access to $1 million. That might make sense. So let me talk to a PE firm. Now, something that I like to do in those situations is I'll put a public offering together. You mentioned crowdfunding. Most people think of crowdfunding with like Indiegogo, Kickstarter, stuff like that, but there's a bunch of other forms of crowdfunding. I can put together my own, what's called a PPM, a private placement memorandum. I can find all the wealthy people in my community. I can send them, it depends on, by the way, I'm not giving you the legal advice on how to do this. I'm letting you know that this is a possibility, but I can identify certain wealthy individuals. and I can give them an opportunity to invest into my company. And one of the things that I have done personally is I do what's called a convertible note, which means I'm going to give you the opportunity to invest into my company, and I'll give you this type of return on this type of term. I have to make it attractive to them. So I'll say 20% return on your investment, if it's a pizzeria, free pizza for the next 2 years or something like that, right? I'll make it attractive to them. But in the event that I cannot pay you back within those 2 years that I just outlined, that debt converts over to equity. Okay, so what that does, it motivates the investor saying, hey, I feel a little bit safer because if you can't pay me back, I take part ownership of the company, but also motivates you as the borrower to make sure that you don't dilute the equity. So I need to make sure that my A game is always, present so that I can have sales high, have, costs low, do whatever I need to do in order to make sure the business is profitable.
I'm glad you touched on that because that's a key thing, right? When it comes to putting a deal together and finishing that deal, getting it all closed, there's always terms that can be put in place to make it more attractive to the seller or to the lender, whoever it may be, right? Nothing's really off on the table, and it's a win-win situation at the end of it.
Personally believe in, and I follow, you're as limited as the limits of your own creativity. So if I can come up with a really cool way to incentivize or create, opportunity, sometimes I'll say, hey, if you give me your services, I can't afford you. You're very seasoned, very polished, very expensive, but I need you for my company. I can do some type of tiered equity, which means we're going to establish these benchmarks in my company. And let's say the first benchmark is a $250,000 of revenue with a bottom line of, 50,000. That's benchmark number one. If you help me achieve that, you will earn 2%, equity into my company, so on and so forth. So, up until a certain cap. I'll say we'll cap it off at 10% or 9%, whatever the number happens to be. But that's another way for me to secure the asset. Or here's another one. I used to own a bar in Jersey City, and one of the things that I did in the very beginning is I didn't want to be in debt. So I developed that use of proceeds. That's the first document that we should always do. That use of proceeds. It's like the shopping list. I'm gonna make a cake tonight. What do I need? And I need eggs. I need milk. I need whatever. So I'll go to the fridge and see what I have, and what I don't have, I add to that shopping list. That's essential first step for any business or any potential business owner to see how am I spending this money. Because what I did with my bar, I said, well, about $20,000 of the money that I was going to borrow was to get some really high end coffee makers. Because I was open up during the day as a cafe, but I didn't want to get myself into another $20,000 worth of debt. So I negotiated with a coffee supplier in the area. They gave me the machine for free, but I had a guarantee to them that I was going to buy X amount of coffee from them per month. And as long as I was able to do that, I no longer had to get into debt for that $20,000. Again, creative financing.
Yes, absolutely. That's great stuff. And I'm sure we can kind of dig a lot deeper into that, but it's really a skill, honestly. You can learn from people, you can learn from your own experiences, but having that practice where you're able to really get creative in those different scenarios. Some people are quick with it. Some people, they have to look to the professional where they have that skill and it comes easy to them.
Yeah. And going back to the pizzeria, I'm using pizzeria because it's a very easy, relatable type of business, that a lot of us can connect to or at least understand. I buy sauce, dough, I make a, product and I sell it, my margins. I am opening up a pizzeria. I just got told by the local school that they can hire my pizzeria to provide pizza once a week for a pizza party, as an example. I asked them, can you put that in writing for me? Which is a very realistic thing to do. So I can say I will be doing the catering, providing pizza to the school, to the local police department, whoever happens to be, put that on paper. Now it becomes a contract. Now, if I'm a brand new business and I don't have great credit, I don't have great cash flow, great collateral, but I still need access to money so I can go get that job, that contract is worth money. So there are specialty loans. We're talking about different types of loans, and that's why it's kind of hard to tell you all the loans that are out there because they each have a certain job. There are loans called receivable loans, because that's going to be a receivable, right? So it's an AR facility, accounts receivable facility, or something called factoring, which is a little bit more aggressive. And these loans don't have the most attractive terms, but it gives me access to capital. And as long as I have a profit margin larger than the cost of doing business, then it makes sense. And that's what I have to look at. Sometimes we get too caught up with the interest rate. Like, oh, I heard my friend got a better interest rate. That must not be a deal. Well, your friend's a different person. Take a look at your business. Take a look at your margins. Does that margin that you have give you enough money to pay whatever that interest rate is? And then do you have a plan to then exit out of that later on so that you can continue to grow organically without that debt? So that contract, again, there's a few different ways to get it financed. Account receivable financing, invoice financing, factoring. All three are different, slightly different variations of the same type of idea. I'm going to show you, hey, the promise to pay came from a very, very high quality entity, the local school. They pay their bills, and they promise to pay me X amount of money for pizza, for my services at the end of each month. That's worth something. So I'm going to sell that contract to somebody else, and they'll say, hey, I'll collect this money and I'll give you 80% of it up front. I'll collect 100% of it, and that 20% is their margin or their profit, the investor or the lender.
Very interesting. That's good stuff. I mean, in Canada, very, very minimal as far as lending goes. So this is one reason why I love the US. If the deal looks good, you'll find the money.
We'll find a way. Money is always there. It's the creativity and the willingness to understand, to understand what the terms and conditions are. Because not all money is great money. I used to work for, again, like I mentioned, the Wall Street firm on Lower Manhattan. And we got, at one time, bad publicity because we lent a large amount of money, a little over $100 million, to a healthcare facility or healthcare system. Healthcare system is a company that owns different healthcare facilities. It could be outpatient facilities, inpatient, hospitals, doctor offices, whatnot. But they needed X amount of dollars. We were able to provide the X amount of dollars. But there are always covenants, little rules that exist that sometimes we kind of glance over. We just see the most important thing, the top line. I'm getting this much money, and it's costing me this much in interest rate, whatever. There are sometimes things like what we have, which is called a non-ute fee or a non-utilization fee. People in the industry call it a non-ute. But non-utilization fee says, I'm going to give you access to a line of credit so you can run your business and have working capital. And this is typically for larger loans. And if I'm going to give you access to $100,000 as an example, that's not the large loan, by the way, but I'm going to give you access to $100,000. That means that me, as the investor or the lender, have to tie up and make sure that I have at any given moment in time $100,000 ready in case you need it for whatever, right? That's the same way a credit card works. But what if for the next 2 years you only use $3,000, $4,000 at a time, which means I am tying up $95,000 and $96,000 of my money to the side that I earmarked for you just in case you need it at any moment, and I'm not able to lend that to anybody else. So that money is not being utilized. So I'm going to charge you one interest rate on the money that you do use and another interest rate on the money that you don't use. That's called a non-ute fee. Now that's, again, typically for the larger, typically middle market and up. Companies that are generating $35 million of revenue and up. But that can exist on a small business that is able to borrow a line of credit for, I don't know, I'm going to make up a number and say, $3 million, $4 million, which sometimes can exist. Very similar to a credit card. Sometimes you have an annual fee on your credit card. Very similar concept.
I want to transition a little bit into the sell side. So when it comes to selling, what's kind of the first step or anything that you would recommend as far as preparing for that sale? What should you be looking at prior to, and should you reach out to an M&A advisor?
Good question. An M&A advisor, I would recommend to engage. Well, I recommend to use professionals at any time. But an M&A specific advisor usually is going to be for the larger small businesses. They come at a certain cost. If I am thinking about selling my car wash, that I have, and my car wash makes $1 million a year, gross revenue, an M&A guy, or girl might not see enough margin there to make it worth their while to invest their time. You have to take a look at how much it's going to cost me to get the services of an M&A person. But if I know that I'm thinking about selling my business, ideally, you want to start prepping 2 years, 3 years before the point of sale. If I I'm thinking about selling now, and I just got the idea yesterday, and I want to put my business for sale tomorrow. I didn't have time to clean up my house, right? And same concept, if I'm going to sell my house, and this is an easy way to think about it, if I'm going to sell my house, before I put the for sale sign on the front yard, I might want to mow the grass, right? I might want to paint the walls. If my sink isn't working really well, I might replace the faucet, right? Those are little things that I can do to increase the value. Same exact concept exists with selling my business. So if I know that I'm going to sell my business, ideally, let me start planning 2 or 3 years before, because the way that I calculate the value of your company is based on financial performance, right? And the paper that has the most amount of weight when talking about financial performance is going to be a filed tax return. So if I can do certain things today to reduce my cost and increase my revenue, whatever that happens to be. For example, I was taking a nice fat salary. Let me reduce my salary. Let me train somebody else. I had my sister, my brother, my cousins working for me, and I was giving them a little bit more money. Or I was kind of lazy and I wasn't really aggressive with entering into a new market. Let me go knock on the doors of the school, like I said before, or the police department to get a contract. Those are the things that I can do today, which are very realistic, that can then increase either my revenue, decrease my expenses, but more importantly, then increase the value of my company, right? Which is ultimately the thing to do. So first piece of advice is try to get as much runway as you can before you put the for sale sign on the outside, and talk to, at the bare minimum, an accountant. We can all talk to an accountant before selling the business, right? Ideally, an accountant that has experience in your industry. Just because I'm an accountant doesn't mean that I am the best fit for you. I should be a CPA that has relevant experience within your industry, and let him or her know, I'm thinking about selling my business as soon as possible. How much time do I need before I can put a for sale sign on the business? And if it's a fire sale because I have to sell it today, then I expect a deflated value of what the company could be worth, because I am in a rush to sell. And the same thing is true for any assets. If I have to sell my car quickly, I'm not going to get the most amount of money, but if I could take my time with my car, I'll fix anything that's wrong with the car, maybe give it a new paint job or at least a buff and a wax, and then take my time to kind of weed out all the tire kickers and wait for the right buyer for my car. That way I can maximize my value. So patience is always your best friend. And that's also true for investing, everything in business.
That makes me think about the buy side as well, because a lot of the times, you really have to think, are you planning to keep this for years? Is this going to be brought down? And it's a generational business that's going to go down to your kids one day. And you know what? If the plan is to maybe grow this business and sell it within the next 10 years, then there has to be a succession plan in place, right? You have to take care of your books. You have to, make sure your house is clean at the end of the day, because if you have to wait 3 years when you decide, it's time, that's going to suck and prolong the whole process, right? That exit strategy that you once had in mind.
100%. So you actually said something that has been a big pain point for a lot of businesses: the succession plan and the exit strategy. Have you heard of the 5 C's of lending?
No.
Okay. Different textbooks will have slightly different C's. Sometimes it's like the 4 C's or the 6 C's, just like in marketing. I'm not sure if you heard of the 4 P's of marketing. It's there's different things that different books will slightly change the definition a little bit, but it's ultimately the same thing. And what you're touching on right now is one that's more relevant, again, post-pandemic than it was prior to the pandemic. So I'll go over the 5 C's of lending. How do I prepare for financing or for attracting capital in general, regardless of what it is? It's connected to the risk profile of what you are presenting. What you think you're going to get into. How risky is this for you and for any potential investor or lender to you? So they're going to gauge 5 areas. You don't have to have all 5 areas with a perfect score, but if I have one that's a little bit weak, then hopefully I should have another one that's a little bit stronger, so I can counterbalance. So the 5 areas to determine whether this is a bankable or even investable from a PE side deal for me is 1, your credit. So it doesn't mean that you need to have a certain credit score. It just shows a credit profile, which says you have had access to similar opportunities in the past with similar amounts of financing, and you were able to responsibly manage it, right? If you and I, have a driver's license, but you're an Uber driver, and you drive every single day for work, but I have a driver's license, but I live on a sailboat and I drive once a year. The fact that I have no accidents on my record doesn't mean that I'm a better driver than you, right? You're in the car every day for 8 hours a day. The fact that you had 2 accidents in the last 2 years, your credit is still better than mine because you have a lot more time practicing and managing your vehicle than I do because I'm out on a sailboat somewhere, right? Same thing with the credit profile. So that's why I want to make sure that nobody's discouraged if they say, my credit score isn't the best right now. So we're going to take a look at the overall credit profile. And then if you're working with someone who is an accountant or experienced with capital markets, they can usually provide letters of explanation for different things, but credit is the first C. The second C is going to be compensation. Compensation means show me that there's enough cash flow for everything to work. They're going to look at that from 2 perspectives. They're going to look at it from you and your household, right? And in your household, are you married? Are you single? What are the total amounts of expenses that exist? What dependents do you have out of your household? And what's the total amount of money going out? What is the total amounts of money coming into the house? Is there money left over at the end of the day? Or are you living paycheck to paycheck? Then they're going to ask the same exact question about the business. How much expenses does the business incur every single month? But what kind of revenue does the business experience every single month? This is actually noteworthy as well. The magic number, perhaps one of the lead ratios that any underwriter is going to take a look at, is something called the debt service coverage ratio. And that means out of the debt that you're asking for, how much can you service it, right? We want to see 125%. That means that for every dollar of expense that you have, I want to see that you're able to generate income of $1.25. That's the very first ratio that an underwriter is going to take a look at. And if that number isn't there, then it either gets pushed to a side, denied, or I have to get a bit more creative. There are specialty lenders that can go down to as low as 1, which means at least show me that you're break even, and maybe we'll talk about financing because there's a better trajectory in the future, right? But anything lower than 1, no deal. Doesn't matter how great your credit score is, doesn't matter how great the other C's are that I haven't mentioned yet. So we have credit, we have compensation. The other one's going to be collateral. Show me what kind of asset you can pledge as a guarantee that in case shit hits the fan and you can't pay your bills, there's going to be some form of a safety net, an asset that you can sell in order to make everybody happy again, right? Now, sometimes that could be a physical asset like a home, which is perhaps the most common one, but it could also be securities. Sometimes, depends on the security. It could be the machinery that I'm buying itself. I'm trying to buy an oven, or I'm trying to buy a truck for my company. That truck is the asset, right? So other times they also take a look at your equity injection into the company. How much risk are you putting into this? Are you putting 10%, 20%, 30% of the overall project out of your own pocket? And how much are you asking me, the lender, to give you, right? That's all codes into that third C, which is the collateral. So those first 3 C's are pretty universal for almost any type of deal. The next 2 are very exclusive to the world of business. One is going to be your character. So if you for the past, 10 years have been working at a bank, but you love to grill in the backyard and you make insane, ribs in the backyard. Everybody loves, the barbecue that you make in the back. On paper, it says that you know how to work at a bank, not that you know how to grill. So as the investor or the lender, I will feel a little bit uneasy because professionally, you're a banker, not a chef. So I need to be able to tell the story to say, hey, this is your character, right? This is who you are. These are the transferable skills that you will be able to bring to the venture to make me feel all warm and fuzzy on the inside, right? So why you? Why should I feel okay that you are in the driver's seat? So there's something that we have to think about. So thinking about that narrative that we're going to include in the business plan, that we're going to include in the professional bio, the resume that goes along with the business package, that makes the investor or the lender feel comfortable that it's you in the driver's seat. Because maybe you don't know anything about. I have a friend of mine who, once I left Wall Street, he bought a hospital. A young guy, but he never went to med school. He was a finance guy like I was, finance bros. But what he did is that he got a collection of other doctors to manage the hospital for him. and they all had a small piece of the pie. So they said, I'll give each of these doctors 5% equity into the company, but I am going to be the lead. I'm going to keep 60, 70% for myself, and I'll split the rest with all the different doctors. So in the business plan, it says that he knows how to read financial statements, not how to run a hospital. But it's okay because he got somebody else to come on board that does know how to run the hospital. So that's that creative financing that we're talking about. So the fifth C is going to be conditions. Condition says what's happening in the world around you and what's good and what's bad. On the good side, make sure that that you're aware of it, put it down on paper, and how are you taking advantage of it? What's bad, how are you how are you bracing for that potential danger? What am I doing to protect myself against that risk? For example, right now, let's talk about the pizzeria again. I have a pizzeria that I'm buying, but it's a Canadian franchise, right? And right now, I don't know what the tariffs are going to look like. That's a condition that I have to be able to acknowledge, because no matter how great I run the business, if my government says any cheese that's coming from Canada has to be taxed at, I'm going to make up a number, 40, 50%, that's going to add cost of goods sold expenses, which is going to reduce my bottom line. So regardless of how good I run a business and how good of a management team I have, my business is not going to survive very long unless I raise the price. But in economics, there's a concept called price elasticity, which says how elastic is that price? How high can I raise the price before the model breaks, or how low can I bring down the price before the model breaks? There's a limit. There's a range to it. So I can't charge $20 for the pizza, for a slice of pizza. At least I don't think you can. And at the same time, if I reduce it to $3, I make no money, right? And then I'm just a charity, and I have to ask for handouts or something. But the idea is being aware of it. So on a business plan, I'm going to address all 5 of those C's, and I'm going to say for tariffs, I'm working with the supplier, and we have a contingency plan in place that in case tariffs go too high, there's going to be XYZ plan. There's going to be a cheese supplier in the United States that they can do, or they'll move a branch to the United States, or whatever it happens to be. But I address all 5 of those C's, and I'm addressing all 5 of those C's in ultimately 2 documents. It's a collection of documents, but there's 2 main documents that put all of that stuff together. It's going to be my business plan. My business plan says the story of how I'm going to run the business. Don't sell me your idea. Common mistake that I see all the time is that in their business plan, they're trying to convince me that they have the best product or service in the world. That's your commercial. That's not your business plan. Your business plan is your workout schedule. It's your recipe. It's the instructions on what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. Are you open 7 days a week or 6 days a week? Is someone there to pick up the phone call, phone call at 8 o'clock at night, or at 5 o'clock in the evening, whatever it happens to be. But the idea is, show me how you're running your business. It's the workout schedule. That's the business plan. Your financial plan, or my projections, or pro forma, depends on how I'm using it. They're ultimately the same thing, but there's some small technical differences. But the difference is my projections are going to tell me the same exact story that my business plan is telling me. The only difference, that the financial plan or the projections are telling me that story with the numbers, and my business plan is telling me that story with letters. And the super common mistake that I see all the time is that they don't tell the same story. They're contradicting each other. So if I say I'm going to spend, what are you doing for marketing for the business that you're buying or the business that you're selling, whatever it happens to be, what were you doing for marketing? And you're telling me social media. But then I go to the financials and I don't see a line item for social media marketing. Somebody's lying, right? There's a disconnect. Yeah. So if you're telling me that you're spending, that you're going to do Facebook marketing, or you're going to do Instagram marketing, or TikTok, whatever it happens to be, and I don't see a line item for that on your financials, I now feel a little bit more uncomfortable with investing into you as a business owner.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You really have to paint that picture. I mean, knowing the right professional to put that document, that portfolio together, to hand it over to that lender that you're looking to get to invest into your deal. That's going to be key. I know we can go all day. We can definitely go all day. Listen, there's so much knowledge that somebody can take from this, and so much more to come. We definitely need to have you back, and we need to talk and dive deeper into different segments, because there's just so much to learn. Let's end it off here. I appreciate you coming on. I'm going to put your information in the show notes for anybody that wants to reach out. Thank you for coming on the podcast, Ryan.
vote.